Hey everyone, it's Lindsay. Welcome to week 6, where we're going to talk about human rights. For a lot of people, they're like, human rights, what does this have to do with anything? Well, it has a lot to do with things, as you have probably guessed with your readings this week. But furthermore, as we're talking about these different sort of things and using them in wider senses of the world. So before I get started, just a reminder that your Step 3, Assignment 2 of your public policy paper is coming up due. So make sure you get those in. Refer to the public policy section of the course to get more information on that. But basically what we're looking at is making sure that you get started on your writing, 1 to 2 pages, your intro sort of ideas about the paper. The main goal of this is to get you to practice clear, concise writing and to help you understand what it is that I'm going to be looking for in the final paper. I want you to do a page to 2 pages because that's a small sample, and so then I can really go through and line edit everything so you know what it is that I'm expecting in terms of writing. Every professor has a different sort of style and preference for how things are written, and so this is your chance, low stakes, 20 points, to get to turn in some writing samples, and we'll start working on those together so that your final paper will be exactly the way I want it. So one of the most important things is making sure that you're citing properly. We use APA citations in public health, and so you're expected to use APA citations, and this is a research paper, and so you need to do heavily cited work. And so yes, nearly every sentence will be cited, and that's not a weird thing. It's a very common sort of thing. And so I have some examples of stuff on the course for you to look at as well. So this week, I chose the topic of female circumcision / female genital mutilation to be sort of our focal point around human rights. This is very intentional. People don't feel lukewarm about this subject. People feel pretty strongly about it. And so I think it's a really good one to be able to parcel out and look at these sort of things. Now, people who are pro sort of circumcision, or people who would say female circumcision, say that there's less likelihood of people engaging in immoral behavior, which results in less unplanned pregnancy, less sexually transmitted diseases, including HIV. There's a belief that it makes childbirth easier. Again, these are the medical reasons that people state. I'm not debating whether or not these are true or not true. I'm just saying this is what people on the pro-circumcision side say. And so whether or not that makes childbirth easier is definitely up in the air as a debate. But we won't have that debate here. We're just talking about why people say it's okay. But again, the biggest reasons that people talk about circumcising their female children is perceived appearance and sort of cultural beliefs. There's a lot of cultural and some say religious beliefs around why people want to circumcise females, and saying if you're not going to be accepted into marriage, you're not going to be accepted into society, this is just what we do. Okay, and then that is sort of their argument. Now, on the anti-circumcision side, people who would call it female genital mutilation say, yeah, this is just cocoa bananas, right? There's a lot of risks, from minor ones in terms of infection and other sort of things, all the way up to death. People do die from this procedure. It's often done without any sort of pain relief because it's done in a traditional cultural sort of sense. A lot of it's done without any sort of pain relief. It's often done by non-clinicians, particularly in Africa. The people who practice it oftentimes have a ritual sort of circumciser, and that is their job, is to circumcise girls or women in their village. There is some belief in, again, medically debatable, that clitoral pleasure is paramount, and so that any kind of removal or touching of the clitoris would be horrible because you're mutilating somebody's potential for pleasure. And belief that any kind of removing of the clitoris or the labia or any of those sort of things decreases sexual pleasure. And so people say this is medically not an okay thing. You shouldn't decrease somebody's sexual pleasure. And then the bigger sort of side of things is people say, FGM is not okay because it violates women's right to choose. It's inherently anti-woman. It's inherently a violent act against women, and women should be able to be in charge of their bodies, in charge of their sexuality, and these sort of things. Okay, those are the two sort of basic sides of the equation. So then what I like to talk about is now why don't we call, or when we're talking about sort of the next sort of comparator is male circumcision. Have you ever heard it called male genital mutilation? Probably not, because that's not a common term, right? But when we think about circumcision worldwide, well, what we have to realize is that there's a lot more males that are circumcised than females, and it's still largely a very culturally influenced practice, right? And so this week you're gonna have a video, a funny sort of tongue-in-cheek one from Adam Ruins Everything about why do we circumcise, particularly in the United States. I have some data in the slides to have you look at these different sort of things. For the most part, the largest countries that participate in circumcision would be Israel because of Judaism, its cultural belief of their faith, and in the United States. Why do we do it in the United States? Because we don't like when dicks look weird. That is what people most often cite for why do they circumcise. Well, that's just what penises look like in the United States, which is not a very solid sort of thing. So oftentimes when we look at these sort of things, people will say, well, these two things are not comparisons at all. Female and male circumcisions are totally different, okay? So then I have a chart in here that talks about why do people circumcise or not circumcise male children, right? So on the pro-circumcision side, people say it reduces the risk of penile cancer. While true, penile cancer is a pretty rare disease, and it only decreases the likelihood of it very, very slightly. So not a super huge reason, but it's a reason that people cite. There is a lower risk of urinary tract infections in the first year of life. This is true, but what we have also found is that, particularly in the United States, our obsession with cleanliness and hygiene actually is the cause of this sort of thing. What they have found is that if you do not forcibly retract the foreskin over the penis during the first year of life, the risk of urinary tract infection goes almost to zero. The reason that people get UTIs when they're babies is because we forcibly retract the foreskin to try and clean under it, because we have an idea about smegma and other sort of things, when in fact the penis and foreskin is pretty self-cleaning. Okay, there is a belief of easier genital hygiene. Again, this is a debatable sort of point. What's hard about cleaning a penis? You just wash it. But for some people, they say, oh, it's just, it's so much easier when you don't have foreskin. Okay. Debatable, but that's a reason that they cite. There is an decreased risk of STIs, mostly because of biology. The foreskin is a mucous membrane, and the only way that STIs can be transmitted is through mucous membranes. If you cut the mucous membrane off, which is the foreskin, well then yes, there's less likely that you're gonna have ports for STIs to enter. So that is a true statement, even though it's not really intended in the way that it sounds. But again, the main reason that in the United States particularly that we circumcise is because of perceived appearance. People say, yeah, uncircumcised penises look weird and circumcised ones look normal. Again, that is a social sort of perception and not based in any other sort of thing. Now, on the anti-circumcision side, people say, yeah, there are risks with doing circumcision even in males. They're rare and they're minor, but they do happen. Bleeding, infection is actually quite common, but even death can happen. Every year, there are several little boys who die from circumcision. And most people are like, what? I didn't even know that was possible. But yes, it is. It's very rare, but for the people that it happens to, you can believe that they would be like, holy crap, like I didn't know my son was gonna die from this sort of thing that we just do without even thinking. The procedure is done without pain relief because it's done typically on infants right after birth. You can't anesthetize infants, that's too dangerous for them. And so circumcision is done without any pain relief. They just take the foreskin off with the belief that since they're babies, they won't remember it, and they give them some Tylenol afterwards, and that's good to go. Some people are like, that's barbaric. Why are we cutting parts of bodies off without any sort of anesthesia? Sometimes the procedure is done by non-clinicians, particularly in faith communities. So if it is in the Jewish community, a bris is done, and it's done by a religious leader who is not a clinician. And so there's a point sort of there. Some people believe that the foreskin is really important. It protects the penis from a lot of different sort of things. And there's a belief that taking the foreskin off also decreases sexual pleasure. Again, this one is a medical sort of citation one, but it's a harder one to sort of prove. We don't have pre and post studies like have sex with your foreskin and then have sex without your foreskin, which one was better. But because the foreskin is made up of a ton of nerve endings, theoretically we can say, yes, that it removes some sort of pleasure. So if you think sex is great with no foreskin, just imagine what it would be like with foreskin. But the main reason that people are anti-circumcision in males is a social reason, a person's right to choose. People should be able to have body autonomy, and little boys should not be mutilated without their sort of consent. When we stack the reasons for and against for male circumcision against female circumcision, or FGM, they start to look pretty similar, right? And so this is often where people start to get really confused. Why is it that we advocate actively for male circumcision? In fact, the World Health Organization has an entire webpage dedicated to talking about why we should circumcise men for HIV prevention, particularly in Africa, which a lot of people say is kind of a racist policy. What they're saying is, we don't advocate for circumcising men all around the world. It's really just in the African continent that we advocate for male circumcision for HIV prevention. What do we do in all other parts of the world? Well, we advocate for safe sex. And so a lot of people say the unintended message there is that African men can't or won't learn how to use condoms, and so we have to mutilate their bodies in order to keep them safe from themselves from getting HIV. That's a compelling sort of argument. Ironically, the World Health Organization has an entire section about female genital mutilation, about how it's such a terrible thing and how we need to fight against it. So on the one hand, WHO says, yes, cut male penises up. And the other side, they say, oh, don't you dare touch women. From this sort of perspective, it's kind of a mixed message. Yes, female circumcision and male circumcision are very different procedures, but fundamentally at the heart of it, it's taking pieces of people's body without consent, and sometimes even with consent. And what do we think about those sort of things? Further, if we look at sort of non-medically necessary plastic surgery in the US, most of those things are done on women. Breast augmentations, liposuction, nose reshaping, eyelid surgeries, tummy tucks, the rise in vagioplasties and labiaplasties and anal bleaching and all these sort of things. How is it that we can tell women in developing countries, no, don't do anything to your body, and yet we find a lot of people in the United States and in Western Europe doing a lot of things to their body, right? So one of the things I like to point out and thinking about is that if feminism believes that women have a right to autonomy over their body, how can we tell women that they can't seek a female circumcision or FGM? Is there some sort of reason if we said okay, maybe let's not do it on children because children can't give consent, but if they're adults, shouldn't they be able to make those sort of choices, right? Women in the US make choices to do plastic surgery, so why shouldn't women in African and Arab nations be able to make their own decision about female circumcision if that's what they choose? Isn't it kind of patronizing for us to say, no, that's just patriarchy and you're just believing that you need to do those sort of things? So is it both sort of imperialist and patriarchal on top of being sort of racist when we talk about these different sort of things? How is this different in these sort of ways, right? Interesting sort of question. I don't have the answers. I don't advocate one way or the other. I'm just asking questions to say, hey, why do we feel so differently about male circumcision and female circumcision? Why are they so disparate? Why do we have these sort of things? Is it because we just think male circumcision is totally common and fine and female circumcision is, ew, that's that gross thing that they do in these barbaric sort of countries and these sort of things? Is there something that could be done? Could we say if women want to get circumcised, if it's done in a hospital, if it's to ensure limited sort of negative health outcomes, should we allow it? Again, we have that question of that doesn't always happen here in the United States or in Israel where it's done by non-clinicians. Should we also be protecting our males from circumcision? Should we start calling it male genital mutilation? Why not? Why or why not? Why don't we have a moral imperative to protect male children from circumcision? So this is one of the reasons that I use this topic as a debate about human rights, right? If you are somebody who is from the United States and circumcision is common, you're like, What? Yeah, of course we just circumcise men. But when you start to look at it from these bigger sort of perspectives, you can see where people in other countries say, well, yeah, you think that's totally fine, but then on the same token, you're telling us what we should and shouldn't do. And that brings up this sort of question and perspective of human rights. What are human rights? Where did they originate? What are they? All those sort of things. So I have a video this week for you to watch about human rights. Talks about sort of the concept, the origin, where did they come from, how do they get applied, and all sorts of things. When you are done with the video, look at who made the video. How does that change your perspective on whether or not it is something that we should be thinking about? Should we have a moral compass based on sort of what we think is science, or is that science somehow open to being skewed? Thinking about applicability of other sort of human rights, how do we do these sort of things, right? We're talking about women's rights to their body and their right to choose for FGM or circumcision. Well, what about sort of feminism from a global perspective? Are women valued around the world, right? Oftentimes we look to Saudi Arabia and other sort of countries and say like, oh, women are so oppressed there. They have to wear a burqa or a full hijab and they can't do these sort of things. How is that different from, let's say, women in this country who are in very religious sort of minority communities? I always like to talk about Michelle Duggar from the TLC show of 18 kids or 20 kids and counting, or however many kids and counting. Her job is to have babies. Is that something she chose? Is it any more of a choice than women who wear full hijab or a burqa or other sort of things? Is it empowering for women to be sexually objectified in media and other sort of ways? Where is women's empowerment really at or coming from, and how do we compare these sort of things when they look very different? But inherently, all of these sort of things are a little bit anti-woman, right? Then we start thinking about other sort of areas of human rights, right? One of the universal human rights is a right to health. In the United States, do we believe that health is a human right? Well, we don't believe that universal health care is a right? And we have to pay for it. It's not something that's provided. If you don't have health care, too bad for you. And so how can we as Americans or people living in the United States say, yeah, we are the arbiters of human rights and values, and yet we don't even guarantee health for our sort of people? And so I think these are really big, important sort of questions, and your discussion this week is going to be based on this. Again, kind of, is there a universal human rights? Is there a way that we can hold everybody sort of accountable? Does science hold the answers? Is there problematic sort of aspects of looking at science as the arbiter of these sort of things? Are we being ethnocentric or imperialistic when we talk about like, well, the things that we like are good human rights, the things that other people like are not good human rights? What are these sort of things where religion and morality start to hit into each other? How do we enact these sort of things without being unfair or without being culturally imperialist or without judging other people culturally? And how do we do this, especially when we don't always value things in our own sort of rights, right? For a lot of people, we say, yeah, racism is still a huge issue in the United States. We don't treat black and brown people with equal rights. And so who are we to tell people what they should be doing in their countries? All of these sort of things I don't have answers for, but I think they're really good sort of things to think about when we start thinking about how do we consider, human rights from different cultural relative sort of perspectives. How do we make it all fair and equal for everyone? All right, that's it for this week. There's a couple of videos for you to watch, and you'll have a discussion for this week's assignment. All right, thanks, bye.